Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for staying with us. There were some technical difficulties, but we sorted them out. So thank you very much for coming today, and welcome to one of our talks as part of the Newman Society here in Leuven. It's a pleasure to have Dr. John Haldane here, all the way from Scotland, so thank you very much for coming. Dr. Haldane is currently J. Newman Razor Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University, Texas. He was formerly and for many years professor at University of St. Andrews, was papal advisor to the Vatican, has delivered a series of the Guildford Lectures, and many more academic distinctions beyond that. But to get to the talk, I'll keep it short. Dr. Haldane has published a multitude of papers on topics such as the history of philosophy, philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and moral and social philosophy. Moreover, he has written many books, including An Intelligent Person's Guide to Religion and Faithful Reason. The title of his lecture this evening is Understanding Character and Its Significance. So again, we are extremely honored to have Dr. Haldane here this evening, and thank you very much for coming. Okay.
Thank you very much indeed. I think learned for the first time a few minutes ago that the pronunciation of E-O-G-H-A-N is Owen. I thought it was only English that really went into absurdity. Some of you may know that that there's a sort of tradition in England, I think just as sort of Fox Americans, of pronouncing place names in ways that bear no relation whatsoever to the spelling, you know. So, for example, B-E-O-C-H-A-M-P, B-E-A-U-C-H-A-M-P, which you might try as Boatchamp or something like that, is Beecham. And there's one, I mean, I wouldn't even tell you how Chumley is spelt. It would be too difficult. Let's just say it has several D's in it. At least one D in it. Anyway, so that says Owen, very good. Now, the last occasion which I saw Owen, and it might have been the first occasion which I saw Owen, was one in which we had a great sing-song in Prague. And I think on the strength of that, I'm surprised that he's invited me, because I was in particularly wild form. I won't say good form, but I was in particularly wild form. And as they say, drink had been taken, as a result of which we had a grand old sing-song, and we covered some real tearjerkers, I think, along the way. But that was great fun. But on the strength of that, I would have thought the last person you'd want to invite to give a talk would be me, because you might have the fear that I would break into song of a particularly rumbustious sort. I'm not going to do that. So the topic of this is understanding character and its significance. And I'll say a little bit by way of introduction and then start to talk about some of the themes. It's hard to resist saying it has already been a bit of a test of character. I left my computer somewhere else, so I wasn't able to do what I intended to do by way of making a PowerPoint presentation. And then, having worked on the PowerPoint presentation, I couldn't get the USB stick to load it. And so eventually, I've been walked in a backpack with the USB stick stuck, hoping it was loading it up. And then, as you may have noticed, we've had one or two difficulties actually linking everything up. But I think all will be well in the Mother Julian of Norwich, all will be well and all manner of thing will be well. We hope that will be the case. So let me just say a little bit about to sort of contextualize this, a little bit about why I'm interested in the issue of character. So some of you may know that, and I need to keep an eye on the time. I'm told that I've got 3 hours, is that right? So I'm okay on that, yeah, all right. I might just go over that slightly, but we'll see, 3.5 hours maybe. Right, you tell, what, 45 minutes should I do? Right, you tell me when 45 minutes is up, all right? Okay, good. So by way of context, this issue of character, why have I been thinking about it? Why is it of interest? Well, I suppose in part the answer to that is connected with a phenomenon in English language moral philosophy that some of you will already be familiar with, which is the rise of virtue ethics. Now, as it happens, well, let me just say very briefly where that rise began. People said, oh, you know, modern moral philosophy has given no regard to the question of virtue. And whether that's true or not rather depends on when you think modern moral philosophy begins. and where you think it's where its geographical boundaries are. It's not true that, of course, within, for example, the Thomistic tradition, that people weren't talking about virtue and so on. That obviously was the case. And in the 18th century Scottish tradition of moral philosophy, Adam Smith, David Hume, and so on, Thomas Reid, all of these people were concerned with virtue. And indeed Kant, who's often sort of represented as somebody who had no interest in virtue, this is simply false. Kant has a 2-volume work on virtue. Utilitarians are sometimes scolded for having no interest in virtue, but John Stuart Mill is quite emphatic about the importance of the concept of virtue. He said in his autobiography, this comes out very strongly, actually, but it also, in On Liberty, he says, it matters not only what men do, but what manner of men they are that do it. And so Mill was very interested in the cultivation of virtue. In fact, Mill, some of you might know that John Stuart Mill, as well as being a very important philosopher, English, well, we like to think of him as half Scottish as philosopher. His father was a Scot. But at any rate, an English philosopher, a Scoto-English philosopher. He was also a member of Parliament, but he was also responsible, a little known fact, for the civil service exam. He designed the civil service exam for the British Civil Service. And of course, this was the British Imperial Civil Service. So you were training people to rule the British Empire, which was pretty extensive. And one of the problems that you had in training people to rule the empire was that obviously in the period we're talking about, the 19th century, they might be in faraway, well, they would be in faraway places. They might be in what used to be called British North America, now goes under the title of Canada. They might be in Australasia, they might be in the South Pacific and so on and such, like in India and so on. And so the question about training civil servants was this, that what do you actually do to equip them to carry out their offices in circumstances in which they can't check back with the imperial office if the question arises that it's not clear what the answer to it is, and so on. And the idea was that a rule book is insufficient because this is the classic problem, what in Aristotle is called equity. It's the question of how do you actually apply a rule. And does a case fall within the rule? Is this a borderline case? And so on. So if I give you a rule that nobody's allowed to cross the lawn, let's say, unless it's necessary, I haven't really told you how to determine whether it's necessary or not. And I haven't perhaps even told you as to whether or not there are some people who might be exempt from that, let us say officials who are responsible for the care of the law and so on. And so what Mill recognized was that as well as instructing people in the law, so to speak, one actually also had to cultivate in them certain dispositions of good judgment. And in other words, what you really had to do was cultivate them in them certain virtues. And so that's why Mill says it matters not only what men do, but what manner of men they are that do it. And so Mill designed the civil service exam to be a test, in part, of course, of people's knowledge of the law, but also to be a test of their character. What would you do in this circumstance? And then these cases would be given, like casuistical training. What would you do in this situation? So Mill, again, had a great interest in virtue. So it's just wrong as some people suggested in the 1950s and 60s, that moral philosophy had simply neglected virtue. What was true was that moral philosophy in England, from the publication of G. Moore's Principia Ethica, had neglected virtue. But that showed you this was not exactly a sort of broad universal perspective that was being taken here. It was a rather local perspective. But all that changed in 1958 with the publication of Elizabeth Anscombe's essay, Modern Moral Philosophy, which some of you will know, in which she's got criticisms of certain standard ethical theories, and then she seems to say, well, if we're going to try to work out some general account, systematic account of good human action and so on, we need to find a place for the concept of virtue. And then she talks a little bit about that. Now, this has been taken slightly inaccurately, but nonetheless, it's inaccurate in two respects. It's been taken to be the first point in British modern moral philosophy, or Anglo-American modern moral philosophy, where somebody sought to invoke the concept of virtue as a central concept in ethical theory. In fact, Jorge von Richter, in his Gifford Lectures in St Andrews, I think 2 years before that, had a chapter on virtue, a lecture on virtue and the necessity of virtue and so on. But Jorge von Richter knew Anscombe. They were both literary executors of Wittgenstein. So it is possible that they talked about these things independently, I mean, prior to the publication of either of their works and so on. But the other aspect in which it's slightly inaccurate is that what people then said was, well, we've got a new kind of ethics, it's called virtue ethics. So instead of having the notion of obligation as central, or the notion of producing certain kinds of consequences, outcomes as central, there's a third alternative. Don't look at what an action produces, don't look at what the kind of action is, but look at the motivations of the agent, and so look at the character of the agent. And so we can determine the rightness or wrongness of an action, not on the basis of its outcome or consequences, not on the basis of the action type, but on the basis of the dispositions of the agent. So you might think consequentialism is one that gives priority to the outcome, deontology is one that gives priority to the action type, and this other ethical theory called virtue ethics would give priority to the dispositions. When I say priority, I mean explanatory and evaluative priority. What I mean by that is that say if you took the consequentialist view, the goodness of an action would be interpreted in terms of the goodness of the outcome that it produced, and the goodness of an agent would be determined by that agent's propensity to perform actions of a type that produce good consequences. If you took the deontological view, you'd say that the priority attaches to the kind of action, and so a good outcome is an action in which the right sort of thing is done, the right kind of action, and a good agent is an agent who does the right kind of action. So it now looked as if there was a position, a third place, that could be filled. You'd say this: the goodness of a good situation, a good outcome, is that it's the product of a good action, and an action is good if it is the expression of a virtuous disposition. And so some people thought that what Anscombe had done really was expand the range of fundamental ethical theories. We had the deontological associated with Kant, we had the consequentialist associated with John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, and so on, and now we had a third kind of ethical theory. Well, the first thing to say about that was not Anscombe's view. Anscombe was not a virtue ethicist. In fact, Anscombe, what she was saying is that we need to, in our total evaluation of action, we need to say something about virtue. We need to say something about the dispositions, the motivations, character of agents. But she wasn't saying that here's a third kind of ethical theory. And in fact, it's just as well she wasn't saying that, because that would be incoherent. Because dispositions are, so if you say to be courageous is to be disposed to feel, to think, to act courageously, let's say. Well, if you said, what's it to be cowardly? The answer would be to think, to feel, to dispose, to act in a way that was cowardly. So what's the difference between courage and cowardice? Well, they both have formally the same structure. The difference is that there is their orientation to a good, the good of human life, you might say. So actually, you can't really characterize virtues independently of a theory of value. You have to have an account of what constitutes a good in human life before you can explain why a virtue is a virtue. I mean, the formal structure of virtues and vices is exactly the same. But what makes one thing a virtue is that it's oriented towards the good, and what makes something a vice is that it's oriented towards the bad. And so the difference comes out in your theory of value. So you couldn't have a freestanding virtue-based ethics. What you could have, and ought to have, is an ethical theory in which virtue is a component in the overall evaluation of an action. Now that brings us to the issue of character, because what virtue formation is the formation of certain kinds of dispositions. Dispositions in this context, I just mean tendencies, settled, developed tendencies to act or refrain from acting towards certain goods. Okay? And the different virtues will be individuated. I mean, that's to say they will be distinguished between on the basis of the kinds of goods towards which they are ordered. So justice is ordered to one kind of good, temperance to another kind of good, courage to another kind of good, and so on. So the differentiation, what makes something a virtue is it's a disposition that's oriented to the good. What makes it the particular kind of virtue that it is the kind of good towards which it's disposed. That's all fine. But what it tells you is you couldn't have a theory that just said that virtue is the key to everything. Virtue is going to have to be combined with a theory of value, a theory of the good, as it were. And in somebody like Aquinas, Thomas interestingly says that the evaluation of an action really has four places, four things to be taken account of. One is the dispositions of the agent. Another is the kind of action that's been performed. A third is the immediate intended consequence, and then the fourth is the further consequence towards which the thing is directed, and so on. And he nicely, rhetorically, one doesn't think of Aquinas as being a rhetorical writer, but he connects with these with the four Aristotelian causes: final cause, material cause, formal cause, and efficient cause. And he says there's four kinds of places that have to be filled, as it were, to determine the value of an action. And he thinks, Thomas thinks, that an action is only good overall if it's good in respect of each of those four things. Right? The motivation has to be right, the action has to be of the right kind, the immediate intention, what it is you're seeking has to be right, and, as it were, the further end towards which this is directed. And if it has to be right. And if it's wrong in any of those respects, it's not a good action. So it's a very stringent and demanding view. But whatever one thinks about the adequacy of virtue ethics as an effort, if anybody really wants to pursue this, to give an account of the totality of ethics, I think that's a mistake. It wasn't what Anscombe intended. I think that she would be sympathetic to the objection I've just made, to any idea that it could be the complete and full foundation of ethics. But what everyone says about that, Anscombe was surely right, and others who followed in her wake were surely right to say that a very important part of the ethical is character, is the motivation, the orientation of the agent. I said that these people who were arguing about, what had evaluative priority, was it evaluation of outcomes, evaluation of actions, the evaluation of motives, and so on, overlooked another kind of priority, which is what I might call developmental priority. Now, what I mean by that is this. Even if you were a consequentialist, or even if you were a Kantian, held the deontological view that obligation is the foundation of the ethical and so on, there is a question about how you would teach somebody to be ethical, right? I mean, how would you inculcate in somebody a knowledge of how to act well? Well, you might think if you were a Kantian, you'd sort of teach them a set of rules. But actually, these sort of sit lightly on people. I mean, sometimes psychologically they sit rather heavily on people, but you might just say, well, I don't really understand what, somebody says lying is always and everywhere wrong. Right? There's a rule. That's what you tell the child, This doesn't really sort of engage with aspects of the child's own life and activity. It's kind of puzzling in a way. Or if you say, here's what you have to do, you always have to act only on that course of action which among those available to you would produce the greatest happiness, the greatest number. You can imagine a child sort of just looking stunned at the face of that. But also they would be aware of the fact of the impossibility of really performing these calculations. So actually there's a further sense in which, on whatever view of ethical foundations you hold, you might think that virtue has a kind of priority. And it's what I call educational or developmental priority. If you actually want to teach somebody to be good, I might, if time permits, I'll actually give an example from a different field, which is painting. If you want to teach somebody to be a good artist, what you want to do is not teach them rules. I mean, there might be some rules that come as part of that. You don't want to teach them about outcomes, because the meaning and value of outcomes has some itself to be understood. What you might try to do is habituate them in certain ways, inculcate in them certain dispositions and inclinations and so on, get them to love certain things and hate other things and so on and such like. So I think that there's a sense in which virtue is prior, and it's this developmental sense, or you might say this educational sense, that the best way of getting somebody to be good is to inculcate in them certain dispositions towards certain things, away from certain things, and so on. Now that brings me to the topic of character, because what we would say you're trying to do in this circumstance is inculcate certain character traits or dispositions of character. I'm just going to press this button to see what comes up next, but I don't feel confident that it's going to be what I want. Whatever point there was to that slide has long passed, so don't worry about that. Okay. Well, here's an interesting case. So this is actually, of course, not ethical teaching, but is artistic teaching, not visual arts, which is my own particular interest, which I might come to later on, but obviously teaching somebody music. Now, one of the things that the musical teacher, the teacher of music is intending to do here, if you just think about it, is, I mean, in this case, we've got the child, reading a score, a partial score up there on the blackboard and so on. But one of the things, I mean, it would be a bad teacher who didn't teach a child to love music. You know, imagine a music teacher who just says, I'm just going to teach you a skill, you know. That isn't the place to start, right? The place to start is with trying to get the child to have a certain sensibility or build on what such sensibility as the child has. You know, you might sing, you might start with whistling, probably not whistling a melody in this case, but, you know, humming a melody or just thinking about songs and one thing and another. To get a child to enter into, you might say, the world of music, what you really have to do is not just teach them the skill of performance, but teach them the love of music, inculcate in them certain dispositions towards certain sorts of things and away from certain things, from the discordant, for example, towards the harmonious and such like. And so one of the things that I think a music teacher is doing is teaching, as well as it were, teaching certain technical aspects of music, in this case music, what they're doing is trying to sort of develop in the child certain sorts of dispositions, or as we might say, traits of character. They want them to be responsible in their practice. But they also want them, as it were, to be responsible for the sake of loving and producing the music and so on. So you're trying to, that's why I'm talking about the primacy of dispositions. You're trying to inculcate these tendencies, these inclinations, and so on. That's why that picture is there. Right. Okay. So this brings me to, as I say, to the subject of character, because I'm thinking that when people talk about virtues and vices, what they really mean are dispositions of character. That's typically what they'll say. They'll talk about character traits. So the courageous person has a particular kind of character trait. It's called courage. The cowardly person, another kind called cowardice, and so on. So we're interested in character traits. And of course, if we're interested in character traits, then we're interested in what character itself is. Now, for a few years in the past decade, in this decade, I was professor of virtue theory at the University of Birmingham as a sort of part-time position. And I was in a centre called the Jubilee Centre, which some of you possibly have heard of, for character and virtue education. And so I became interested in character and in its role in education in a very particular context and way. And what struck me was that, there was some very good work being done there, particularly by somebody called Christensen, who's done quite a lot of work on sort of Aristotelian-based virtue education and so on. But it struck me that people talked about character, it was in the title of the Jubilee Centre, but without really saying what character is exactly. And the more I thought about this, and the more I sort of tried to find out what people had to say about it, it seemed to be like a receding horizon. You know, it just seemed to sort of be fading away all the time. And it is interesting, this fact. Why is it that actually people have great difficulty in talking about what character itself is? They'll sometimes, among psychologists, they'll say, oh, well, today what I want to talk about is character and personality. And then they'll just never mention character again. They'll just talk about personality. And indeed, the whole field of psychological study called personality theory, in which that's meant to be the place where character should be studied. Now, as I shall go on to say, I don't think character and personality are the same. But that just raises the question of what character is. Before I develop some thoughts about that, however, let me just say that there has been a bit of a, there has, at the same time, so just let's try to sort of get the map here. 1958, Anscombe publishes Modern Moral Philosophy. 56, I think, Jorge von Richter gave the Gifford Lectures in which he talked about virtue. They didn't get published till 57, I think. I can't remember, at any rate. But says from the late 50s, people started to talk about virtue. And then a colleague of Elizabeth Anscombe's, Philippa Foot, she gets engaged with that. And then some students of hers develop this and so on. And there begins this kind of virtue ethics movement. Either virtue ethics in the strong sense, which I think is incoherent, that virtue can be the sole foundation of the ethical, but more commonly, people who are just interested in particular virtues. You know, they want to talk about particular justice or whatever else it may be, and so on. There's a whole body of literature. Now, and then psychologists kind of got interested in something related to this, which is called positive psychology. Oh, it got better, didn't it, down here? Called positive psychology, and some of you may be familiar with the positive psychology movement. This was Martin Seligman at the University of Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, was one of the principal figures in this. The positive psychology movement said, look, psychology for the most part has been concerned with psychopathologies, right? Things going wrong. And if you think about psychology in its practical application, you will think about things like clinical psychology, right? Therapeutic practices designed to rectify psychological problems of one kind or another. And Seligman said, look, why do we think about positive psychology? Not psychology as it was sort of as remedial, or trying to correct certain bad tendencies, but about psychology as the study of positive characteristics and so on. And you can see, and Seligman did see, though he wasn't a philosopher, isn't a philosopher, that a connection here between the idea of an interest in virtue as dispositions towards the good and so on, and this idea of positive psychology as the development of positive character traits and so on. So psychologists got interested in that. There was a sort of booming movement over the last 40 years, something like that. But it grew and grew. But at the same time as that was happening, there was a pushback against the notion of character. And that pushback, I just mentioned 4 cases of this pushback. One was within psychology, and this is sometimes connected with what's called the situationalist critique. And does anybody know what I'm talking about? Is there anybody who does the phrase the situationalist critique? Okie dokie. All right. So I think what we'll do is we'll cut that conversation short. Let me just tell you what the situationalist critique. So, according to the virtue theorist, or you might imagine this is what the virtue theorist is going to say. All right, that a central part, if not the totality, a central part of good action is being disposed to act in certain ways, to feel in certain ways, to respond in certain ways, and so on. All right. And so if you're trying to make good agents, right, what you want to do, as Mill was trying to do, was to inculcate these habits of feeling and sentiment and response and action and thought and so on in them. But the situationalist critique was based on an interpretation of a certain empirical work in empirical psychology. And this work was to do with what people did, how they behaved under certain sorts of conditions. And I won't kind of spend too much, I'm not going to spend any time talking about that experimental work, but just give you an example of it. So it turned out, for example, that if people had had a good bit of good fortune, and how you might do this experimentally, you might ask them to go, you know, could you go and fetch something from the other building or something of that sort? But you've laid out their sort of 20-euro note, all right, and they find the 20-euro note, you know, and so they sort of quite, this cheers them up, and they behave well thereafter. Whereas if you sort of secretly take 20-euro note, you give them a 20-euro note, let's say, and then you sort of palm it, so they think they've got it, but they haven't got it, and so on. And then they get to the shop where they're supposed to buy something, they haven't got the 20. They get very stressed and upset and so on. They don't behave badly, they don't behave well, they behave very badly indeed. So there are a whole series of experiments in which what it's meant to show is that the determinant of action, the principal determinant of action, is not any settled aspect of your character, but actually a response to the situation in which you find yourself. So I don't know if people are familiar with this rather sort of dramatic experiments in which people were invited to, they see somebody who's wired up in a room adjacent to them, they're told that this is an important psychological and physiological experiment and so on, and what they're to do is to sort of turn the knob that inflicts certain degrees of discomfort and going all the way up to extreme pain, right? And you'd think that, and they got students in, and would you do this, and so on. But then they start to sort of put pressure on them and say, look, this is you really have to respond in the way that I'm telling you to do. You're mucking around here, right? You'd increase it. And it turns out that people were quite, by the way, this is all theatrically done, right? I mean, the person who's lying there is just an actor for these purposes, and they're screaming, no, I can't take anymore. And the guy's just turning up the knob and so on. Now, what that's meant to show is that your behavior in circumstances is conditioned by the situation in which you find yourself. Your behavior is not conditioned by settled, habituated dispositions, right? It's a function of aspects of the situation in which you find yourself. So this situationalist critique was launched, and it looked as if it was going to do a great deal of damage to the whole idea of virtue and character and so on. In moral philosophy, we've got this question about the relative priority of different things, and the consequentialists were fighting back and saying, no, what has a vital priority is outcome, and the Kantians were fighting back and saying, no, what has priority are the kinds of actions and so on and such like. Interestingly, in literary theory, big move against character. Now, of course, in literature, people are concerned with characters, right, in a novel, the characters. But, one of the sort of big things of 19th century novels, I think of George Eliot in particular as a very pronounced example of this, is the exploration of the character of the characters, right? I mean, the character, those features of the subjective features of the portrayed individuals and so on, become extremely important. And it's quite a feature within modernist literature in general, this focus on character and so on. But then you got a set of literary critics who kind of react against this. And they say, look, no, the real role of character, and I mean characters, portrayed characters, but also the character assigned them, in novels is to show the extent to which actually people are products of their environments. So this is a kind of switch from an interior picture that says, if you want to understand how people are behaving in a certain narrative context, you have to try to understand the interiority of the subject, right? Their own perspective on the world and things of that sort. To say, no, if you want to understand how people behave in the world, you just need to look at the situation they're in. So it's a more behavioristic perspective. And in literary theory, there's been a whole pushback against the notion of character as being the proper sphere of imaginative literature. It's really to do with situations we're to understand and so on. And then in educational theory, one of the things about character education that has been a criticism of it is that it sounds as sort of indoctrination. And so that, you could think of a sort of totalitarian, you could think of a sort of Maoist education, revolutionary China, where, the individuals, the population are being led into certain ways of thinking. Their characters are being fashioned to be good servants of the state and things of that sort. Or you could think in a kind of more moralistic, conservative way that when people talk about character, they say, I don't know what this person like. You tell me they're skillful, but are they a person of good character? And when that question is asked, are they a person of good character? That's just, I sing this in a conservative voice, in case anybody was in any doubt whatsoever. So that's a sort of the conservative voice speaking, right? I don't think this chap's really for us. They're not really. That's right. So that was basically when I first entered academia at St Andrews. Occasionally there was still that voice to be heard. You'd interview somebody, they got their PhD, they got 10 articles, whatever it was, and the very well, I don't think this chap's for us. That's basically how, by the way, the vetting for MI5 and MI6 was conducted. It was basically on the strength that I don't think so. Oh, really? I don't think this chap's for us. And that was a judgment of character. I don't know about their skills or abilities. I don't think he's really the right sort of person. Anyway, now you can see that, so the notion of character came in for attack because it was associated on one hand with sort of totalitarian indoctrination, and on the other hand with a kind of classist, elitist, boys' club, basically, and so on. Now, I think those criticisms can all be met, right? I mean, there's nothing in the notion of character and the formation of character in itself that disposes either to conservatism or to radicalism, right? I mean, you could be of either disposition and still think the notion of character is important. That's what we need to fashion. In literary theory, I think there's been a shift away from this. There's been a reaction. And as in psychology and moral philosophy, I think what people would say now is that how people behave is the upshot of two broad factors. facts about them, their dispositions, their psychological dispositions and inclinations and so on, and the situations in which they find themselves and the pressures that they're subject to as well. But you can't really explain human behavior without bringing in these dispositions and inclinations and such like, even if they're not the whole story. So this kind of got me interested in the question of character. And I'm still interested in the question of character, just as well. It wouldn't go too well if I said I've lost all interest in this topic. Yeah. Now, so that got me thinking about where does this notion of character come from and how should we understand it? Now, the first occurrence of a term that is reasonably rendered as character in philosophy, it probably originates in Greek drama, but let's not worry about that, is in a fragment from Heraclitus. And the Ionian pre-Socratics, the people who come before Socrates, if you study the history of philosophy, you study Thales and Anaximander and so on and such like, Anaxagoras and such, they weren't much interested in ethics. I mean, obviously Socrates is the big moment in the history of Greek philosophy where the ethical is made a central concern. But there is a fragment from Heraclitus which is rather interesting, and it's man's character is his destiny. Now, the word that destiny renders here is daimon, and what he's saying is this: it had hitherto been supposed in the literature of the time, in the drama of the time and so on, in the epic poetry, that people's lives were shaped by forces, sort of personified forces, but you could kind of think of as cosmic forces that determined their fate, right? Your daimon was your fate, as it were. That you know, whether things go well or badly for you, whether you behave well or badly in your life and so on, was partly to do with, as it were, some independent force that sort of bestowed either blessings or curses upon you, put you in difficult situations or afflicted you in certain ways, or more positively, you know, put you into good situations and so on. If you want to understand the notion of a Greek daimon, think of a guardian angel or a guardian demon. Well, it wouldn't be a guardian demon, it would be an aggressive demon, right? There's this sort of spirit that each of us has, or maybe a couple of spirits, attached to each of us. And let's take the guardian angel, right? Say your prayers to your guardian angel, because your guardian angel is going to see you through, as it were, help you through, right? So that's what a daimon was. But you could have a good daimon or you could have a bad daimon. But the point was, your destiny wasn't within your own hands. It was down to how the daimon chose to lead you in life and so on and such like. And so Heraclitus is very importantly saying something quite different. He's saying that man's character is his daimon. It's a man's character is what determines his destiny. Now, of course, Heraclitus wasn't ignorant of the fact that bad things can happen to people, but if you think about the character in that context, the courageous man is able to deal with the bad situation in the way in which the cowardly person is not. So he says this fragment stands alone, by the way. Man's character is his daimon. For man here, because it's the misfortune of English, that man is used most generally, I suppose, to refer to the male human being, but it's anthropos, so it's human being's character is destiny. Now, move forward a bit. Aristotle says things about traits and such like, but he doesn't really say much about character. But his student and friend and literary executor, Theophrastus, does. He writes a work called Character Traits, or translated as Character Traits. You can see, by the way, that we've already got the term, or the proto-term ethico coming in here. And Galen has a theory of what determines character traits in terms of the four constituent sort of elements of human physiology, and bile and dark bile and one thing and another and so on, the blood. So he's giving a sort of material account, a materialist account, of what shapes people's characters, you might say. It's their physiology. Now, I just introduced a bit of Kant there because, again, Kant's one of those, as I said earlier on, who's represented as having no interest in character, but actually, just read what he says there. He says, distinguish A, natural disposition, B, temperament or sensibility, in which the subject is mostly passive, and C, character, purely and simply, or way of thinking. This is how he characterizes character. And then he first says the first two predispositions indicate what can be made of the human being. The last, moral predisposition, indicates what he is prepared to make of himself. And so you can see a connection there between the Heraclitus remark and Kant's remark, that is what character is to do with what something is within your control, is subject to your self-formation, not exclusively, but for which you can then be held responsible in your actions. Okay, now, because for reasons of time, I don't want to, I'm going to move this along a bit. So, I'm just asserting this now, okay, so I'm not going to argue for it. Might argue, anyway. Character, I say, is located with, I'm going to distinguish character from certain other things, all right? So character is located within individual personal psychology, says Haldane, at a level deeper and more stable than manner, temperament, and personality, though less profound than specific and individual identity. So when I've been reading some of these writers, in particular, I mean more recent writers and contemporary writers essentially, on what character is, it slides all over the place. I already talked about in personality theory, people talk about, oh, we're going to talk about character and personality. And you say, sorry, stop. Are you going to talk about character and talk about personality? Or are you going to talk about character and personality? And of course, they just they end up sliding the personality into their place. There's a reason, by the way, why they do it that way around. They don't drop personality and talk about character. They drop character and talk about personality. I'll explain why that is, why I think that is. So I want to distinguish between character, manner, temperament, and personality. And I want to say manner is the most superficial, temperament is deeper, personality is deeper still, and character is deeper yet. But character is not the same as your identity. When I say they're deeper, here's one mark of their being deeper. I'll talk about two marks actually, but here's one mark of their being deeper. Changeability. To what extent can you change one of these? So it's much easier to change your manner than it is your temperament, and it's easier to change your temperament than it is your personality, and it's easier to change your personality than it is your character. So there's a sense in which malleability is one thing there's a sense in which it's deeper, right? It's more deeply rooted in some sense. So, you know, if I said, look, do you realize that you have a rather, when you speak, it's not about your personality, it's just about your manner. See if you can say that, right? Not about your personality, just about your manner. You're not an aggressive person. I know you're not an aggressive person. Your manner's just a touch aggressive, right? So could you cut that out, right? Just remember, there are other people present, just calm down, sit right, and I can say, oh yeah, I'll have to be careful about this, you know. I can work on my manner relatively easily, yeah? Somebody says, oh, I think, thank you very much for telling me that. Just keep reminding me when I'm shouting at people. Just remind me not to be aggressive, okay? But supposing you said to somebody, oh, well, you know, I don't know about your manner. What about your temperament? Change your temperament, right? Well, you go, how am I going to do that, right? That's going to take more work, yes? But I could see how I might work on that, yes? I would train and, you know, observe what I'm doing and all that stuff. Then you say to somebody, yeah, well, you're getting well with the manner and the temperament. It's a personality you really need to work on, right? Then somebody's going to go, I mean, my manner, that wasn't too bad. Temperament, that was, you know, personality, woo, I'm not sure I can do much about it. And then I said, look, I don't know, forget the personality, it's your character that we really have to work on. You know. Then I think we realize that we've sort of, you know, gone through certain levels. By the way, I think there's a fifth thing, which is demeanor. I might try and say something briefly about that. All right, so we've got, what have we got? We've got manner, temperament, personality, character, and demeanor. And I think it's important to distinguish these, okay? I mean, for example, you could say, just to show that personality and character aren't the same, you might say, he's got a simple personality, but a complex character. Oh, you just have to think about that. Just choose examples of your own. Right. So there's another sense, however, in which I think character is deeper than these other things, and that is that it's not an observational concept. So I think that character is a theoretical concept. I realize I'm going to have to cut some of this, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, what do I mean by that? Okay. So I don't think there are any, but just imagine the observational and the theoretical on a spectrum, right? So you'd have sort of purely observational concepts over here, and you'd have purely theoretical concepts over there. Right? Now, there are complications attendant to the idea of purely observational concepts, purely theoretical concepts. But think of these as sort of directions in which you might move, right? You might move away from the observational towards the theoretical. You might move from the theoretical towards the observational. Now, what do I mean by this contrasting pair? Well, one way of seeing this is think about the observational is to think about how you might teach somebody a concept and how somebody might verify whether a concept applied. Okay? So it would be very difficult to get very far in teaching somebody color concepts without actually indicating specimens of those colors. Right? If I want to use somebody, what's cobalt blue? Right? I say, oh, well, that's interesting. That's a very theoretical question. No, I'm going to have to sort of actually, at the end of the day, show you a specimen of cobalt blue. How does it differ from aquamarine? There's how it differs. Okay? So color concepts, I don't think they are purely observational. Let's not go into all of that. But they're at the observational end of things. Okay? The idea of a force field, for example, is at the theoretical end of things. All right? Or the concept of a domain, for example. I mean, let's just take a field. Let's say a gravitational field. Okay, that's at the theoretical end of things. And there are some that are in between and so on. Now, what I said that the one way of marking this difference in terms is terms of how you teach somebody one of these concepts and how you could verify the application of one of those concepts. So in the context, let's take the more observational ones. You teach them in part by giving them specimens or examples of the thing in question. You know, what's middle C? Ding, there's middle C, or it wasn't, but anyway, there's middle C or something of that sort. And if you ask somebody, are there any red objects in the room, right, then you would test their capacity to operate with the concept of red by their capacity to distinguish the number of red things in the room and so on. So that's the sense in which it's at the observational end of things. The theoretical end of things, they are not, as it were, taught observationally, and they're not confirmed observationally. How these terms get their meaning is through the generalizations in which they feature, right? So in other words, they're part of a network of concepts, and their role, these theoretical concepts, is to tie together other concepts, right? So the idea, for example, of an electrical charge or voltage or resistance, these concepts are interdefined with other theoretical concepts relating to physics and things of that kind. Now, I think that manner is at the observational end of things, right? You know, I can see somebody's manner, yeah? I mean, I can say, you say to me, so what was the problem? I said, I thought you were being a bit aggressive there. Maybe it's not really a matter of your temperament, but I do think it might be a matter of your manner. And they say, what was it? You said, it was when you slapped them in the face. That was the point at which I thought, there's something not quite right here, okay? But in other words, just, you can see how that, and then, again, if you try to teach somebody the concept of manner, you'd say, well, look, let's take some in cases. Watch these people, right? We're going to have two people who are going to behave in different ways and so on. Now, can you say anything about the difference in their manner? And they would refer to aspects of what they'd seen or heard and so on. But as we go through this list, I think when you get to character is a theoretical concept. That's to say, it's not an observational concept at all. It's a theoretical concept. And what does it do? Well, I think the concept of character is the concept, it's a unifying concept. It's a concept that brings a number of things together. So in one sense, what you might say, let's try this as a first shot. It'll turn out to be wrong, but let's try this as a first shot. Somebody's character is the set of their dispositions, beliefs, feelings, so on and such like. All right? It's the set of those. That's their character. Now, I don't think that can be quite right for the following reason. If we just take the notion of a set, as it were, in its mathematical origins, sets are defined by their members. So the set consists of 1 and 2, the numbers 1 and 2, is the same set as the set that consists of the numbers 2 and 1. Right? So sets don't have ordering in them. I mean, you can write down the members in a certain order, but they're not defined by their order. A set is just defined by its extension, the set of the number of the objects in the set. Okay. But I think that's so the phrase to say, oh, it's a set of characteristics or something of that sort, I think isn't quite right, because I think it's more like a sequence. So in a sequence, so for example, the set that's defined by the membership 1 and 2, and the set that's defined by membership 2 and 1 are the same set, right? Because it's just the members define the set. The sequence 1, 2 is not the same as the sequence 2, 1, okay? So I think that one of the things that a character is, I mean, one's character is it's true that it's, as it were, a number of features, but it's those features standing in certain ordered relationships. Not necessarily well-ordered relationships, but certain ordered relationships, okay? And part of what you're trying to do in educating somebody in the sphere of character and so on is to make them, well, ultimately what you're trying to do is to enable them to understand their own character and to act upon it, right, to change it in certain ways. Now, since character, Wittgenstein once said of pain, it's not a something, but it's not a nothing either. I want to say of character, it's not a something, it's not like a something else, but it's not a nothing either. It's, as it were, it's the totality, or some large number of, these features of you, but it's also them in the relation in which they stand to one another. And one of the things that we want to do in character education, first of all, is get certain things into that collection of beliefs, feelings, sentiments, one thing or another, right? Get certain things in there. When you're teaching that child the violin and so on, or any musical instrument, or to sing, or whatever it might be, you're trying to get certain things into them, certain inclinations, dispositions, sentiments, and so on into them. But you also want to get them into certain relations of proportion and priority and things of that sort. But ultimately what you want to do is to equip that child to do that for themselves as well. Now here's the implication, I think, of this. Since character isn't a something else, along with character traits, it's the relationship between them. The only way in which you can change your character is by, as it were, changing the membership of things that are in that totality and the relationship between them. Okay, so if I tell you you really need to change your character, there is no way of just changing your character. How you change your character is by changing the elements that the totality of which and the relationship between is what we call character, right? And so you work on those individually in certain ways. Now, I realize time is short, so I'm going to switch, I think. Yeah, so let me just, where did this come from? Right, 3 types of students in art. So there's a 17th century work, early 18th century work, Antonio Palomino's Museo Pictorio e Scala Optica, in which he sets out certain rules for the education of artists. And he distinguishes 3 types of students of art, all right? The knowledgeable enthusiast, aficionado, right? The curious, curioso, and the diligent, diligente, okay? So the knowledgeable, enthusiast, the curious, and you can decide for yourselves which you fall into in any given sphere, right? And then I'm saying, this is me talking now, the knowledgeable enthusiast and the curious correspond to familiar categories of the connoisseur and the dilettante. Dilettante now is a term that's used as one of abuse, but it doesn't mean that. It might just mean people who are interested in a number of things and so on. So I think the knowledgeable enthusiast is like the connoisseur. The curious is like the dilettante. Now, in the training of craftsmen in the Middle Ages, they differentiated various, and then this moves into the Renaissance, into certain categories and so on. And There are these stages: the beginner, the first degree of painters, the copyist, the hard-working, the creative, and the perfect. All right? This is the idea of you would pass through these stages in the education of an art. Painting was what that was concerned with, but it would apply to other ones as well. Now, I think these are in part formations of character. Right? It's not just that people are acquiring certain skills, they're owning those skills in ways that relate to their dispositions, their affections, their sense of what's important, and so on, their values, you might say. Now, I extract from all of this 3 models of the art teacher. And sorry, again, my interest is in the visual arts, but you can apply this to choreography, to music, to one thing, another, and so on. So in the Middle Ages, the model really was that of the exemplar. Right? That was to say somebody who possessed the skills and the habituated understanding and judgment. And they had a certain character, right? The exemplar had a certain character. They didn't just have the skills, but they had certain feelings connected with the exercise of the skills, the understanding and judgment, and so on. Then in the Renaissance, you get a new kind of figure, the master. The exemplar just is there as something to be followed, okay? The exemplar teaches you, but also they're just, as it were, there as they exemplify the things, and so they set the standards for you, and so on. The master is slightly different. So the master, as it were, adds to these skills erudition and discrimination. Right? So instead of the master, they really have these further things. They've got everything the exemplar had, but in addition to that, they have erudition and discrimination. And they want to transmit these. That's why they're in this role as master and so on. Now, I think in recent times, actually, in art education, and more generally, actually, in education, there's been a shift from, just as there was a shift from the exemplar to the master, to the advocate. So the idea of the advocate or the facilitator, right? So the educator is somebody who isn't trying to, as it were, induct you into certain practices and so on. They're somebody who's going to enable you to, express yourself in various ways and so on. This is not unlike child-centered education in the Deweyan tradition that was so influential for a long period and so on. Now, I think the trouble with the advocate is that they're not in the business of forming character. They sort of just leave it to the person themselves. So I think this is somewhat of a neglected role. Now, these are just this, now we're into entertainment, right? I mean, you can ask any questions about what I've said so far in a moment, but now this is just, well, not entertainment, it's an example. Actually, 3 examples, I think. Just bear with me, yeah. So last year, prior to studying philosophy, I spent 5 years in art school, and then I taught art for 3 years, and then I taught in an architecture school on a visiting basis, and then I started writing for art magazines, reviewing exhibitions and things of that sort. And so I go to art exhibitions. So last year, there were 3 major exhibitions that were of great interest. I mean, they were great interest, full stop, but they were great interest to me in particular, partly because I was interested in what the people were doing, but also they seemed to bear upon the things that I was thinking about character and so on. So one was in San Francisco. It was Wayne Thiebaud, Art Comes from Art. This is quite interesting. Art comes from art. He's already situating art within a tradition, right? And part of what the artist teacher has to do is transmit the tradition, introduce the person into the tradition. There's no route to art other than through art, is roughly speaking what's being said here. And Wayne Thiebaud, does anybody know Wayne Thiebaud's work? Okay, you're in for a treat. This is Wayne Thiebaud's work. Now, people thought that Wayne Thiebaud was a pop artist. You can see why they might think he was a pop artist. His subject matter often was the kind of gaudier end of American diners. There's the sort of, there's the crispy bacon and scrambled egg end, but then there's the stuff that's in the glass cabinet, and it's all these highly glazed, shiny-looking sort of things and such like, of which these are examples. And so it's easy to think he's a pop artist. In the usual sense of that, kind of like 60s, hey, get with the vibe, here's the colors, enjoy, and all the rest of the stuff, okay? Now, actually, he isn't really at all. What he does with these, it's extremely interesting, this work. He uses the colors and the textures, or he engages with them in the ways in which he actually puts the paint onto the canvas. So where's the sort of cream, there's actually this long stream, thick of paint, you know, so the paint, as it were, represents the cream in two ways, right? I mean, it visually represents it, but it actually sort of mimics it. You see what I mean? The paint is itself like cream that's spread onto there. And there are various things, I mean, it's worth noting. For example, one of the things that he does here, I don't have a pointer, but if you look at the shadows that are cast, all the shadows actually, that are cast, all the shadows have color, right? You see the shadow of this, what do you call it? What's the thing on the right called? Somebody help me. What are they called? Knickerbocker glory. Something like a Knickerbocker glory. That's the thing in the glass. Thank you. That was my wife. That's her contribution to tonight's lecture. Okay, so Knickerbocker glory. An important contribution, because I couldn't have said what they were called. Right. So there's, you see the shadows green and so on. Now, this is partly in observance of the fact of the matter, colour shadows actually are coloured, but also it was the great discovery, really, you might say, of the Impressionist painters to paint, particularly shadows on snow, you know, 'cause you think, oh, well, that's going to be grey, isn't it? It's a colour. So there's already an art historical reference in this. And the thing about Wayne Thiebaud is that he lived to be 100, and he painted his last painting, among his last paintings was a self-portrait. It's very interesting to see. This was a fantastic show, both because of the glories of the works, but also because it revealed the extent to which he is, in a sense, a traditionalist about art. A traditionalist in the sense that it's the handing on of one generation to the next, not just as a set of skills, but a set of dispositions, inclinations, and so on. And this is a nice work of his, where he's actually painting masterworks, right? So it's actually a painting of the kind of postcards you could buy in a gallery when you go and see these great artworks and so on. So it's a homage to art itself. And what he's doing here, he's trying to sort of emphasize that the virtues of art, as it were, are inherited, transmitted dispositions that have been learnt in one generation, refined, developed, handed on to another, and so on. Just keep going, yeah. Kerry James Marshall, I'm not going to talk about Kerry James Marshall, there isn't time now. A very interesting black American painter who, again, some of Kerry James Clark, this was at the Royal Academy in London, some of Kerry James Marshall's work, early work, is not really very good, frankly. And it's rather political in ways that are sort of get in the way of the art. One of the things he did was to paint black people on black backgrounds. And you can see what that was, like they're invisible, right? See what I mean? So, you know, people who are marginalized groups. And that's okay. I mean, I'm not against that idea, but it's a bit of a kind of gimmick. It's a sort of, it isn't what you might say a deeply and pervasively insightful rendering of the challenge of marginality in art, right? But his work just gets better and better. And it gets better and better as his character deepens and deepens, his own character. And his own character deepens and deepens as he learns from historical art. He just studies more and more art of the past. And that's why it's called, in part, the histories. His art is about art, just in the way that we saw earlier on with that painting of Wayne Thiebaud's. You see this as the black painter here and so on. His work has a political orientation, but his work becomes much more interesting when it actually starts to, as it were, exhibit the dispositions and characteristics, the virtues of the painter. And then the other exhibition was at the Louis Vuitton Foundation in Paris. Did anybody see this, the David Hockney 25? Okay. Right. So this is quite nice. This is a painting by David Hockney of his parents. But if you see at the bottom, there are some books there, and in the mirror there's a reflected image. Okay. Right, now watch. Hang on a second. Now, the vase of flowers, here's Chardin. Now, I know it doesn't look like the Chardin, but this idea of the vase of flowers is a sort of iconic element in the development of still life painting from the 18th century onwards. So there's almost an art historical reference in this. But this is another painting. It's called Looking at Pictures by Hockney, in which it shows looking at pictures on the screen, it shows this art critic, friend of his, looking at these pictures. This is an art critic. He's not looking at the originals, he's looking at these reproductions, okay? But you'll see that one of the reproductions is Piero della Francesca's a portrait of the baptism of Jesus in the River Jordan. I know it's a bit blurry and so on. But if you look, that's the same painting that is, can you see it there in the mirror? The upper painting in the mirror? It's the same painting there. And now it's getting a greater degree of prominence. And just like Wayne Thiebaud's painting those postcards of art, here's Hockney making his homage to what made it possible for him to be an artist. What made it possible for him to be an artist was not some sort of child-centered expressiveness. You know, he wasn't just kind of letting it all out. It was actually, he was letting it all in, like drawing it all in. He was forming his character from the outside in. And this is one of the things I want to say about character. Character is not the manifestation of something pre-existing within you. It's the formation of something within you from sources out with you, which is why teaching is so important. And then, that's the baptism of Christ by Piero della Francesca. And then, very nicely, the National Gallery in London decided to exhibit these three works together. So there's the painting of his parents over there. There's the art critic looking at the thing, and there's the Piero della Francesca. That's actually a photograph of the National Gallery holding these three things together. And Hockney was absolutely delighted by this. It wasn't just a sense of sort of vanity, oh, there I am next to, you know, this work and so on. It was that they'd got it, right? This is a demonstration, as it were, of the thing that Hockney himself is convinced of, that what made him an artist were other artists, other and better artists. And he modeled his own character as an artist on these other people. Not his personality, that's different, right? Oh, yeah, about teachers. I don't know about this, yeah. So I did survey. I said I was a member of the Jubilee. I'm going to stop. I said I was a member of the Jubilee Centre at one point. Well, it's still sort of associated with it, this centre at the University of Birmingham. We did some surveying. Well, other colleagues did some surveying of teachers' attitudes. And it was quite interesting. Teachers, they focus on an extended present and are somewhat ahistorical. So they'll talk about teaching today, but today doesn't mean today, and it doesn't mean yesterday. It's not quite clear what the span of today is, right? I'll talk about teaching in the modern day or something of that sort. They presuppose a common profile of the teacher across subjects. I think that's just a mistake. There is no such thing as the profile of the teacher. What it is to be a music teacher is different to what it is to be a physics teacher, is different to what it is to be a sports teacher, and so on. And they make no reference to tradition or authority or superior role or office. But in the formation of character, tradition and authority are extremely important, because you have to, as it were, put yourself under the direction. You know, it's like becoming a Zen monk or something of that sort. You have to find your master and such like. Actually, it's literally like that. Does anybody know the work Zen and the Art of Archery? Extremely interesting book. It's a very short book. It's how you become a Zen archer. Ask me later. Now, but I'm saying they need to attend to the particularities of fields, including their history, see how teachers see themselves in relation to their subjects, and so on. This is all part of, as it were, the formation of teachers' character. Now, I'll just end with this. In the De Veritate, I'm going to end with two quotations. One is from Aquinas and the other is from Wittgenstein. Okay? This is from the De Veritate. Sorry, just to explain something. St. Augustine had this work. I mean, it really is a work by St. Augustine, and it's got this title. It's called the De Magistro, of the teacher. It's quite a short work. It's quite an interesting work to read. The De Magistro. Now, it would be oversimple to say you're either an Augustinian or a Thomist. But it is true, historically, these have represented rather contrasting strands. The Augustinian inheriting through Neoplatonism aspects of Platonism, the Platonic view, and the Thomistic, the Aquinian, inheriting from Aristotle certain views and so on, and such like. So there is a significant marked difference there. In his writings, Thomas, of course, is always concerned to try to show that whatever he's going to say is consistent with what Augustine said. So he respects the authority of, mark of his good character, he respects the authority of Augustine and so on. But, remind me to say something about Newman, but at the end somehow. But he also goes his own way. Now, St. Thomas never wrote a work called the De Magistro. Augustine wrote a work called the De Magistro. But Thomists wouldn't want to be in the situation in which their man hadn't written a work on a subject the other guy had, okay? So at some point, some people found in Thomas's writings a work called the De Magistro, right? It's 3 questions in the De Veritate, which is a large set of questions, obviously on truth as the principle. That just takes it from its initial starting point and so on. But what they extracted from this were these 3 articles, these 3 questions and the articles that compose them and so on. And then this got published as the De Magistro, Thomas's De Magistro. So it couldn't be the case that Augustine had a De Magistro and Thomas didn't have. Thomas has got this one here. Actually, what the questions in the De Veritate that extracted are about, Thomas's discussions are actually about the causality of knowledge, and it addresses a very ancient problem that Plato, a sort of paradox that Plato, that appears in the dialogues, in which the question is, how can you teach somebody? Because either they don't understand, in which case, how are they going to understand? You can't get a grip, as it were. How can you help them? Or you can get a grip, but that's because they already understand, right? So how can you actually teach somebody? Teaching is impossible. Now, of course, teaching isn't impossible, so we must do this. But what has to be true for teaching to be possible? Well, something has to be true of the subject, the person who you're going to teach, and something has to be true of the teacher. Okay, and Thomas is interested in what those are. The other part of the solution of the Platonic paradox is that knowing something isn't an all or nothing matter, right? It's not either you know it or you don't know it, right? There'll be sort of degrees of knowledge and things of that sort. But anyway, in the course of the De Veritate, I'm calling it not the De Magistro, because I'm going to its proper title, it's the De Veritate. In the course of those questions, Thomas does address some questions to do with the teacher. And here's one of the things he says in relation to this. This is to do with the causality and what has to be true of the subject, what has to be true of the person who is the teacher, what has to be true of the student, what has to be the teacher. He says, since prudence is concerned with particular matters of action, and since such matters are of infinite variety, no one man can consider them all sufficiently, nor can this be done quickly, for it requires a long time. Hence, in matters of prudence, now, his example is prudence, but it could be other things, other attributes of character. Because remember, prudence is a virtue, right? It's a character trait. In matters of prudence, man stands in very great need of being taught by others. And I want to say the same is true for all character traits, especially by seniors who've acquired a sound understanding of the ends in practical matters. And this, of course, is where Hockney and Vain-Thibault are recognizing in the relation to the arts, right? If a man is to develop in the sphere of the aesthetic, they stand in need of very great need of being taught by others, and so on. Now, he says, it's a mark of docility to be ready to be taught, and consequently, docility is fittingly regarded as a part of prudence. Now, this is quite interesting, because if you were doing a report on somebody, or a reference on, you said they were rather docile, you think, ooh, don't know about that. I mean, it sounds like passive, inactive, inert, and things of that sort. But actually what docile means is teachable, right? And it's a virtue to be teachable. It's a virtue. It's part of the virtue of prudence, says Thomas here. Now, compare that, and then this is my last slide, I hope. Yeah, so this is Wittgenstein in Uncertainty, I think. Yeah, so probably the last thing that he wrote. He says this: a pupil and a teacher, that's the situation he's introducing. A pupil and a teacher. The pupil will not let anything be explained to him, for he continuously interrupts with doubts, for instance, as to the existence of things, the meaning of words. Imagine this smart little kid, you're having to restrain your hand not to anywhere. A pupil and a teacher. The pupil will not let anything be explained to him, for he continuously interrupts with doubts. For instance, it's a fact about Wittgenstein. One of the things he was most guilty of, felt culpable about in his life, was hitting a child when he taught children. All right, a pupil and a teacher. The pupil will not let anything be explained to him, for he continuously interrupts with doubts. For instance, as the existence of things, the meaning of words, etc. The teacher says, "Stop interrupting me and do as I tell you. So far, your doubts don't make any sense at all." Right? These doubts are just idle doubts. You know, excuse me, sir, you're talking about trees today. Are there any such things as trees? Is there a world out there? Right? I mean, that's just sort of, you're just interrupting the business of education. So just take that, be quiet and listen to me. Right. Or imagine, he says, that the boy questioned the truth of history and everything that connects up with it. And even whether the earth existed 100 years ago. Imagine this kid in your class, right? Now, Wittgenstein goes on to say, and it would be just the same if the pupil cast doubt on the uniformity of nature. That is to say, on the justification of inductive arguments. It'll go like this in the future because it went like this in the past. The teacher would feel that this was only holding them up, that this way the pupil would only get stuck and make no progress, and he would be right. It would be as if someone were looking for some object in a room. He opens the drawer and doesn't see it there. Then he closes it again, waits, and opens it once more to see if perhaps it isn't there now, and keeps on like that. This is connected with induction, right? Our belief that things will continue in the future as they continued in the past, right, is a fundamental cognitive disposition you have to have, right? And this kid's, somebody's opening this, it's not there. Let's have another look. It's not there, right? As if somehow, the course of history could change and it would be there where it wasn't there before. And he says, then he closes it, waits and opens once more to see if perhaps it isn't there, and keeps on like that. He has not learned to look for things. And in the same way, the pupil has not learned to ask questions. He's not learned the game we're trying to teach him. Now, game, of course, is a term of art in Wittgenstein here. He's not learning the practice that we're trying to teach him. And so induction in education into a set of ideas and values and so on is inducting somebody into a larger thing, the practice of learning and then the practice of knowing. And that goes back to the violin lesson there. What the teacher's doing is inducting the child into a set of practices. And in the process of inducting them into practices, you're seeking to form their character. You're seeking them to get them to have certain inclinations, beliefs, dispositions, values, and so on and such like. But not only that, you want them at some point to take responsibility for that and themselves put these elements together in some sort of relationship. And that's what improving your character is. It's putting these elements, well, it's getting the elements right, the right elements, but then it's putting them into the right relationship. And I said to say something about Newman. You will know, famously, John Henry Newman, two great figures of the 19th century, John Henry Newman and John Stuart Mill. It's quite nice, John Henry Newman, John Stuart Mill, right. So they both write on the universities and the purpose of a university. And Newman says that, he talks about what universities are for. I need to qualify this in a second. But anyway, he says one thing they shouldn't be doing is research, what we would now call research, right? The acquisition of new knowledge. That's not their business, says Newman. John Stuart Mill, in his rectorial address to the students at the University of St Andrews in the 19th century, 3 hours talk, I'm going to match that, 3 hours talk, Mill says, the one thing the universities ought not to be doing is professional education, dentistry, engineering, law, medicine, and so on and such like. And you don't think, wow, the modern university is both of the things that both Newman said it shouldn't be, and the arts and humanities are all engaged in research, and science is engaged in research, and then professional schools and all the rest of it. It's very important to understand that when Mill said that and when Newman said that, they were concerned with what they understood to be colleges, not universities in the big institutional sense that we have now. When Mill gave his rectorial address at St Andrews, he was giving it in St Salvator's College, right? And there were students there also from St Mary's College and from St Leonard's College, right? And when Newman was talking about his experience as an educator, he was thinking about his experience at Oriel College and Trinity College. So what they were concerned with was undergraduate education of the kind that went on in college. And what they both thought that a central task of that kind of education was, and remember this is the Mill who wrote the civil service exam, was the formation of character, that it was actually inducting people into certain traditions and practices, inducting them in an authoritative manner, in order that they themselves should come to be able to think. It was a liberal education, it freed them in a sense to think and so on. And so I think Newman and Mill and all the good people in the world have been concerned with the question of character And so understanding what character is extremely important. And it's very interesting, if you look at most of the literature on this, the authors never get round to say what character is. They say, I'm going to discuss character. Well, character traits are dispositions to so-and-so. They talk about character traits. Or they say, I'm going to talk, if they're psychologists, say, I'd like to talk about character and personality. So personality is a very complex thing. The word character never appears again. So we need to think about what character is. What I'm proposing it is a structure that has within it a set of dispositions, inclinations, and so on. It's not another thing, but it's not a nothing either. It's a relationship. It is, as it were, a sequence rather than a set. It's not mere agglomeration. It's not a kind of well-defined set. It's a sequence. It's an ordered combination of elements. And on that, I shall stop. So thank you very much. Sorry, too long? Yeah. Oh, absolutely, yes. Might even have time for a few answers. Let's see how.
I might be greedy and just start myself.
Of course, please do.
So you were mentioning Wittgenstein.
Yes.
And in the philosophical investigations, he mentions this kind of difference in language game.
Yeah.
And that almost the teacher will say, will give a sign to see if they can go on. So say the sequence 1, 2, 3.
Yeah.
And you only know in a certain respect if they understand, if the teacher can say they can go on and continue the same sequence.
Yeah.
And then, so you need to understand that form of life, that language game. And also, he mentions a part where there's a difference between expecting, say, a table in a room or expecting someone that you're going to meet. And that's noticeably, it's namely like you look for the person when you expect them to come, but where's the person gone? But when you're in a room, you don't look, oh, where's the table gone? You expect the table to be there. So there's two different types of expecting, and they're kind of two different language games as well. But I'm saying this because it seems that there's a certain sequence, like you said, in expecting someone to come versus expecting a table to be in the room. So they're two different language games because one is there and one you're waiting. So then I'm trying to think. This is my second part of my question. This is the actual question: is if character depends in part on virtue, and virtue depends on the doctrine of the mean, perhaps. So
We're really covering the territory now. Go on. Yeah.
It depends how you act, right?
Yeah.
My question is then, if character itself is sequenced,
Yeah.
is there a way? Would that mean that the sequence sometimes changes depending on the circumstance?
That's interesting. Yep, I understand. Yep, I got that. Okay. So let's just very quickly go through this. So the first thing you referred to is what's come to be known as the rule-following considerations. Okay. So this is sometimes put in a skeptical way. So I teach somebody, or let's forget the case of teaching for a second, come back to it. I observe somebody going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. Or I ask somebody to start, I say to you, look, I'd like to, for whatever reason, doesn't matter, it's an experiment here, I'd just like to start counting. Start with 1, go on, 1, 2, 3, keep going, and so on. Now, what you would expect them to do is 4, 5, 6, 8, 7, 9, 10, let me see if I can get this right, 11, 12, 13, so on and such like. But supposing at some point they said 35, 40, 50, 60, up to 100, and then you went 200, 300, and so on and such like. You might be a bit perplexed, but of course it would turn out that what they were doing conformed to some rule, right? I mean, that's to say the rule might be when you get to 35, I don't know, whatever number I was at, you start adding tens on, or you jump to by hundreds or whatever it might be, and so on. And Wittgenstein's point is that any sequence of behavior can be made to conform with some rule, right? So how do we know in the case in which somebody's going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on and such like, that they're following the right rule, right? And why would we say that when somebody got to 50 and then went 100 and so on, that isn't the rule we meant? And if we're teaching somebody, how do we know? Have I secured their understanding of this when I go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4? And then how do I know? Because when they get to 50 and they jump to 100, that wasn't what I meant. So how do we determine what I meant? And how do they determine what I meant in order to understand it? And how do I understand? So these questions of meaning and understanding are connected. And what Wittgenstein seems to suggest there, which is connected with the business of expectation, actually, what Wittgenstein seems to suggest there is that there are ways of going on, which are absolutely important for us, central to us, that don't consist in the application of an algorithm or something of that sort, right? The difference between getting it right and getting it wrong is not that one conforms to a rule and the other one doesn't. They both conform to rules, right? But one conforms to the rule that we follow, right? Not the other rule. So, as it were, the we follow this rule is a fact about us. Now, if you might say, why do we follow this rule? That's an interesting question, but it would be a sort of psychological, sociological, anthropological question, and so on. Ultimately, it's going to come back to the kind of beings that we are and the kind of needs and interests that we have. Okay, so even these practices that seem rather abstract and remote, actually, at the end of the day, are to be made sense of in terms of the kinds of beings that we are. Our nature, you might say. And Wittgenstein is a kind of naturalist, a philosophical naturalist, but not in the modern sense or the contemporary sense of that as a sort of philosophical reductionist. He's not sort of trying to reduce it to biology or reduce it to neurophysiology or whatever it is. But he's wanting to say, look, as it were, philosophical anthropology is the key to it all. It's understanding what the human being is that enables us to understand why we think that 50 is the right one to come after 49 rather than the other one. It's not because one conforms to a rule and the other one doesn't. They both do, but which rule matters is the one that, as it were, in some sense expresses some aspect of our common humanity and so on. Now, on the expectation, I thought you were going to go slightly differently with that, but let me just say this. Who is it? Simone Weil wrote on the poem of Force. Anybody help me with that? It's on the Iliad. Oh, it doesn't matter. Anyway, there's an essay. I think it might be Simone Weil. Anyway, it's called The Poem of Force, and it's an essay on the Iliad. And she makes the point there that, and this is very interesting, this is the right place to talk about it because it's to do with phenomenology, so it's very much in the Husserlian sort of in the air tradition, that when you enter a room and there's a human being there, you behave quite differently to as if there wasn't a human being there. And as you approach a human being, at some point you halt, even if that human being is sleeping. I mean, you might go beyond where you would normally go if you were in doubt as to whether they were alive or not, right? You tried to hear them breathe or something of that sort, okay. But absent that kind of concern, even you would be restrained in approaching a sleeping person, right? Even a sleeping person. As if, as it were, there's a kind of field around them, a personal domain, right? And that her point is that to do violence to somebody, you have to overcome that field of resistance, right? Our natural disposition, if that was a human face there, and you say, touch that person's face, I'd go, I have to overcome a sort of natural resistance to touch their face. Now, of course, in questions of intimacy, that's different, but that's intimacy, right? But in the ordinary way of things, we would, and furniture doesn't do that, right? Now, we might respect furniture. This is, what's his name? Who's the Cardinal Mercier, right? This is the lectern that Cardinal Mercier himself made while he was a 14-year-old boy. Nobody knew he had a hobby of woodwork and so on, but this is the one he made. Didn't know that, did you? But anyway, I told you now. So, don't scratch it. Have some respect for it. But that's deferred, right? That's your respect for the man, right? And this is his work. So, even when we respect an object, it's to understand why we respect that object is ultimately in terms of why we respect other human beings, right? Because of this sense of their personal being and so on. And again, that comes back to human nature, both the nature of what we're dealing with, and so we don't touch it, but also our nature, because we have this commonality. We understand what it is to be one of them, because we are one of them. And there's a sort of mutual recognition of their own space, so to speak. And I'm using space not just as a sort of physical sense, but as it were a personal sense of space and so on, their own being. What was the last bit of it?
The question was if character depends on virtue.
Oh, yes.
And virtue depends on the situation.
Yes.
You know, the doctrine of the mean. Does then the sequence that you mentioned that character is made up of, does that also change depending?
Oh, yeah, on the depending, yeah. Well, let's leave about whether character depends on virtue, because there are a few links there that would need discussion on the one themselves, in and among themselves. Yes, I mean, just to give an illustration of that from Aristotle, which I mean, it's a very formal but brief one. Aristotle thinks you can't exercise any of the other three cardinal virtues without prudence, right? So, you know, to be courageous is not just to be disposed to face down danger. I mean, what I mean is you could be foolhardy in facing down danger, right? So the courageous person exercises this certain kind of physical disposition or physical and psychological disposition in conjunction with prudence, right? They have to judge, is this the right time, the right place, the right circumstance for the right reason? And those don't belong to courage, those belong to prudence. So you can't really exercise courage as courage, qua courage, independently of deploying practical good judgment, phronesis or prudentia, prudence. Now, I think one implication that has is that the well-ordered character, if I can put it that way, is one who will foreground certain things in certain circumstances and background them in another, right? Actually, we were having a conversation, Stephen Kuipers and I had a conversation earlier on about sort of pastoral guidance and things of that sort, right? And the person who's trying to help somebody who's in a difficult and problematic situation morally, let's say, and maybe in their personal relations with other human beings and such on, you have to kind of start where the person is, and you have to try to sort of work your way. You try to get them over here, but they're way over there, right? And you can't just sort of run in and say, right, drag them across to there. No, that's not going to work. You have to sort of, you might foreground certain considerations and background others. We'll leave those for the time being. You know, we can come back. You wouldn't necessarily say that to them. You just think, that's not the place to start. So you, as it were, in your own set, as it were, are prioritizing certain sorts. There may be compassion over something else, which in another circumstance might not be the appropriate thing to do. But also you're trying to, as it were, engage the the dynamic shape of their own dispositions, right? Where can I engage them? What is in them now that is the place where I can take hold in order to reorient the set of their the structure of their dispositions. Is that okay? Okay, good. Please.
Thank you for being here. It's been very enlightening. I teach high school civics, and I am very tempted to hear this and say, what I need to do is inculcate a desire for justice. And then I realize, I see that, and I'm like, yes. But then I realize, how do I cultivate these virtues, character in myself? Because I don't want to just take this as this is relevant for all the other people.
Yeah, but not for me, yeah. Oh, so that was a question, was it? Oh, right. I thought you would say that's the question you ask yourself, and then you were going to tell me what the answer was. No, that was, you'd like me to tell you what the answer is. First of all, see, so Aristotle distinguishes two notions of justice. There's one use of the term justice in Aristotle where it just means anything what we would now call moral or ethical, roughly speaking. Well, anything we'd probably call moral. That's just to do with our relations with others, all right? But then there's specific justice, which is to do with what is owed to others, right? What we owe to other people. So that's a sort of what's due to them in some sense. And I think if you're talking about I'd probably be talking about the cultivation of the virtue of justice, you're really talking about that second sense of justice, not just being ethical totally or morally across the board. Well, there I think relates to my opening remarks about how you can't just have a virtue theory. It has to be tied to certain other. I mean, it's an essential part, but it's an incomplete part. Okay, so if you're trying to think about, am I a just person in my dealings with people? Right? Well, the first question you might ask yourself is, what do I owe to these people? Right? I mean, before you can decide whether or not your behavior I'm talking about specific justice now, whether your behavior is just or not, you have to think about the context of one is there something that's owed to those people? And if so, what's the basis of that being owed to those people? Is it some particular debt that I've incurred, or it might be in virtue of my role that I owe certain things to? As a teacher, I owe certain things to them. But it might be more generally, it might be that you might think that, for example, that this, you could argue this is charity rather than justice, but this person is in need, and so I owe it to, I'm the only person available at the time to address that need and so on. You might think that's a duty of charity, but you might also think it's a duty of justice, right? So I think it's just sort of thinking, I've got to be just. What does that mean? How am I going to be just? What's a just? You have to think, well, what is justice? What's the object towards which justice is directed? Just like if you want to be courageous, what's the object towards which courage is directed? Danger and so on. So I would be thinking there, I'd be asking this is like examining my conscience, right? I'd be sort of saying things like, well, have I been unfair in certain ways to people? What would unfairness amount to? So the reflection isn't just a reflection on have I been or should I be. It's what would it be to be and why should one be, right? So would it be unjust to, well, I'll give an example of Aristotle's own. Aristotle thinks that if you're distributing flutes, you don't give one to everyone, right? You give them to flute players, right? You're just some idiot that thinks sort of justice requires the equal distribution of flutes, right? You just think, don't put him in charge of the distribution of goods. Flutes go to flute players, and you might say the best flutes go to the best flute players, or you might not, depending on what you. In other words, you'd have to. I think the way to work out, am I being just, is to think about what is required and called for by the context of the circumstances, and that might be, in the case you're talking about, role specific. It's not what do I owe to them as human beings. It's what do I, or even as neighbours or something. In this case, it's what do I owe to them as people for whom I have a responsibility, for whose education I have a responsibility, and then am I, behaving justly with respect to that? And then now I think about justice in my dealings with others more generally. I use that. It's always good, as it were, to work out from particular examples than try to work in from general principles. I don't know if that helps at all, but that would be a thought. Was there a hand up there? No. Okay. Yeah. Well, character is, as I said, I think is a set of these things. Somebody wrote, when I was thinking about this and I was looking at stuff, and quite a good philosopher, but he said, this must have sounded very good to him at the time when he wrote it, but on reflection, I don't think it's so clever after all. He said, personality is the appearance of which character is the reality. And I'm sure when he typed that, he thought, wow. Let me see that again. Actually, this particular person would have handwritten it, but he said, personality is the appearance of which character is the reality. Wow. What does that mean, right? I think that personality is essentially a psychological notion, right? I mean, remember we had manner, temperament, and then we get to something like personality. I mean, supposing sort of you might say there was an aspect of their personality. I mean, the way to get at this is to start to think about how you'd fill out a description of somebody's personality, right? You might say they had rather outgoing personality, right? Or that they were highly sociable, okay? Now, somebody could be highly sociable in that sense, and that in one sense might be quite a good quality, but they could still be of bad character. Right, so we can imagine sociability belongs to the level of personality, right? But we're talking about something different when we talk about character, I think. So I think, and I also think that personality is nearer to the observational. I mean, you work towards that. So we work from manner, and then we go to temperament. Supposing I'm just trying to, I've met somebody for the first time, or I'm trying to get to know somebody, or I'm a teacher and I'm trying to work out, the different pupils and their needs and one thing and another. I might say, well, I've observed their manner, and I'm just wondering to what extent that manner reflects their temperament. And then I think, is this temperament part of their general personality, right? But then there's still a question beyond that, which is the question about their character. And there I'm thinking of their character as being this, I'm trying to avoid using the word to say it, but let's say this group of characteristics relating to their emotional life, their cognitive life, their volitional life, their willing and so on and such like. But it's it's a theoretical notion, character. It's, as it were, it's like the concept of a field or something of that. I mean, I don't mean a field, a grassy field where the cows are. I mean a sort of force field or something of that sort. It's something that is where you work. It's a unifying and explanatory notion, right? So the concept of character is a concept that we came to, made, because we needed to have a concept that unified these different elements of one's psyche, right? One's volitional, emotive, and things of that sort, at a level deeper than personality. And again, think about this, is that inviting someone to change their personality, I mean, and somebody could say of themselves, you know, it's interesting, I do find that my personality has changed. It's partly because of the way in which I deal with people. It's partly the way in which people have, you know, corrected me of certain sort of things. It's also, I've seen it was a bit juvenile and things of that sort. But you see, I think juvenile applies to personality. It doesn't apply to character, right? I think character is something different and something deeper. We need the concept character because we want to have a concept that unifies these dispositions that we think are of great importance, whether it's in the arts or in everyday life and so on. They're part of what is the good for human beings singly and collectively. Whereas I think personality, we might sort of say, well, you know, yeah, I know his personality is a bit sort of slight, but actually his character is solid. You know, or you might think of somebody who don't have much of a personality, but they've got a hell of a lot of character. Okay, yes.
I'm thinking about this levels of depth.
Yes.
And the criteria for it being changeability. And given that we're using the words like formation or we are associating a level of changeability to character as well. And I was wondering your thoughts on habits and how we could change that if we can, and through manners. So on the surface, no changes on the surface.
Well, that's a good point, yeah. By the way, let me just say, about character, I don't think that character itself is causally efficacious or can be effected, right? Now, why do I say that? Well, because I think character is a structure of relation, a structural relation between certain features. How you change your character is by changing the features, right? And the priority, the way in which they're related. So there's no way of, there is no sort of direct route of changing your character other than via the component elements of it, okay, and the relation in which they stand. So I need to foreground this, I need to background that, I have to give more priority to this, I have to strengthen this, I have to weaken that, and so on and such like, okay? That's how you change your character. But what you're changing are the component elements and the relationship in which they stand. And that's why I say character isn't something else of which these attributes are attributes. Character just is the group of features and the relation in which they stand. So how you work on somebody's character is working on these features, right? You know, their tendency to be fearful, for example, or, you know, their tendency, and so on. And you try to, and how I work on my own character is in that way. And how my character influences my actions. When we say my character influences my actions, it isn't really my character, because character is just the structure. It's the individual, it's the individual features and the relationship between them that is what explains my behavior. Sorry, what was the last bit of that? And how do...
Yeah, whether... Like,
you know, it's about the levels. Well, I think this is interesting, actually, because I think that a good place to start, and I think this is a theoretical or philosophical or conceptual point, not just a practical one, is start on the surface and work in. Right? You don't change your manner by changing your character. Right? I mean, you're... In fact, somebody's manner could look quite different depending on what view one took of their character. You know, I mean, somebody who's quite good on this, actually, I'd thought about this for the first time, was Iris Murdoch in The Sovereignty of Good, where she talks about how it is that, you know, you initially saw somebody in a certain way, their behavior as being sort of a bit vulgar and sort of inappropriate, and then you see it in a different light. Okay. Well, you might say if you want, if you want to see somebody differently, try ask yourself questions about how this manner relates to character. But it's also if you want to change yourself, well, start with manner. I mean, it depends what you're trying to change, right? But it's like, look, I remember when I gave up smoking. Okay, I used to teach in a convent school. When I was at art school, you never had a cigarette out your hand, right? A bottle of whiskey in one hand, cigarette in the other hand, right? Paintbrush in your mouth. Smoking was just ubiquitous, such like. And I used to smoke these things called number 6. They were about that size, and they were bitter like hell. Anyway, but we thought we were, whoa. Anyway, I then taught in a convent school. Smoking was forbidden in the school. So I used to get home, I used to smoke about 20 cigarettes in a night, it's just sort of wake up for the day. Then I thought, I need to give up smoking. How am I going to give up smoking? And I thought, well, I know I'm going to give up smoking. Do you want a cigarette? No, you don't want a cigarette. Do I want a cigarette? No, you don't want a cigarette. This doesn't work, right? What I had to do was do things like not have packets of cigarettes on me, not be the sort of person who went into a room in which you could smoke. In other words, I had to, as it were, work inwards from what you might think of in themselves from the point of view. I mean, ultimately, when you're no smoker, you can go into a room in which people smoke and it doesn't disturb you. But if you want to give up smoking, start on the outside and work in, right? So I think that's the same way about, it depends what stage somebody's at, and it depends what the issue is. But yeah, work down, in. Yeah. Have we got time? No?
We don't have time unless it's a quick one.
Right. Okay, that's fine, yeah.
So thank you very much.
Not at all. My pleasure.
And as a reminder, tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., downstairs in LLB, the lecture hall of the wooden chairs, there will be a seminar by Dr. Haldane on his paper, What Has Metaphysics to Do with Wisdom? So if you can attend that, that would be fantastic. Thank you very much.
Very good. See you at 10 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you. So sorry for the slow start, but we got there in the end, and you saw some nice paintings. Right. That's mine, and those are mine. Not at all. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect. That's great. Thank you. Just stop this.